Hey, it's Brett, and this is Brett and Some Books. Today we're continuing the plot to seize the White House by Jules Archer. This is Chapter 4 of Part 2. When a revolution broke out in Honduras early in 1903, Cutler's battalion was dispatched there aboard an old banana freighter, the Panther, as part of a squadron under Admiral Coughlin. On the second day out, the ship's commander summoned all hands to the quarterdeck to complain that someone had been using profane language near his cabin. "I know the guilty party cannot be one of these fine men," he declared, indicating the sailors. "Therefore it must have been one of these men enlisted from the slums of our big cities." Pointing to the Marines, he restricted their use of the deck. Butler restrained an impulse to apply the tip of his boot to the seat of the commander's naval rectitude. "Then and there," he recalled later, "I made up my mind that I would always protect Marines from the hounding to which they were subjected by some of the naval officers." At the end of his duty in Culebra, his father had reproached him for not having kept him better informed as to what was going on in America's naval outposts. Now Butler did not hesitate to write his father field reports in the plain language, sometimes asking him to use his influence on the House Naval Affairs Committee on behalf of the Marine Corps. Thomas Butler did not always consent, but did serve informally as the Marines' court of last resort against Navy hostility. In Honduras, Smedley was vague as to what the trouble was all about, noting, "It all seemed like a Gilbert and Sullivan war." He led a force ashore at Trujillo between government and rebel forces who were firing at each other to rescue the American consular agent. After seeing some duty in Panama, for which he won an expeditionary medal, he returned to the Philadelphia Navy Yard in 1905. A pretty Georgia-born girl named Ethel Conway Peters, some of whose family had been prominent in the affairs of Philadelphia since colonial times, helped him make good use of his leave time. They were married on June 30th at Bay Head, New Jersey, in a military wedding. Commented the Philadelphia Inquirer, "Cupid and Mars in a wedding by the sea at high noon today." Their honeymoon was a world trip made possible by orders assigning him to the Philippines as captain of Company E, 2nd Regiment. Arriving with his bride by way of Europe, India, and Singapore, he was stationed at a small naval base on Subic Bay, 60 miles north of Manila. Here, in November 1906, his daughter Ethel was born. Butler's popularity led to her adoption by the regiment. Giving a dinner for the enlisted men, he carried her to the table on a pillow as a guest of honor. Not surprisingly, she grew up a Marine brat, and years later married a Marine lieutenant, John Well. With a detachment of 50 men, Butler spent several months dragging 6-inch guns up mountain tops to defend Subic Bay against possible attack by Japan, an attack that did not materialize for another 36 years. He and his men lived ruggedly on hardtack, hash, and coffee. A Navy supply tug, which never brought them supplies or rations, continued to ignore them even when they signaled that they had run out of hash. Butler decided to sail to the Navy supply base across the bay. With 2 volunteers, he set out on a native outrigger. A typhoon blew up suddenly behind them, ripping away their sail and snapping their paddles. For 5 hours, they fought to keep from drowning until the storm finally blew the seafaring trio ashore at the supply base. Soaked and chilled, Butler lost no time in arranging to have the supply tug carry beef and vegetables back to his men. The hungry Marines cheered on his return on the tug. The camp dock had been swept away by the typhoon, so they splashed out into the bay to form a chain that passed the food from tug to shore. Butler was a hero to his men, but not to the Navy brass who heard about his bypass of official channels. A Navy Board of Medical Survey decided that his taking the outrigger into a typhoon and using the tug to take supplies back to his men suggested signs of an, quote, impending nervous breakdown, end quote. He was ordered home. In October 1908, despite the dim view of him taken by the Navy brass, he was promoted to the rank of major. His fitness reports, submitted by his commanding officers, could not be ignored. All unanimously rated him outstanding, commending him as a strict disciplinarian impatient of inefficiency, laziness, or cowardice. His contempt for red tape and his personal bravery were acknowledged to have made him one of the more popular and successful officials in the Corps. His units were distinguished by a high esprit de corps because of his devotion to his men, his concern for their welfare, and pride in their accomplishments, and his democratic insistence upon rolling up his sleeves to work beside them physically. Shortly after his second child, Smedley Jr., was born July 12, 1909, Butler was put in charge of the 4th Battalion, 1st Marine Regiment, and sent to Panama. Although he was stationed on the Isthmus for 4 years until the Panama Canal was opened, he was temporarily detached 3 times to command expeditions into strife-torn Nicaragua. Washington had decided to intervene openly in the internal affairs of that Central American country. Butler's orders each time were to, quote, protect American lives and property, end quote. He soon realized that this general order involved propping up Nicaraguan governments or factions that were favored in Washington for business reasons. The Conservative Party was seeking to drive the Liberals out of power. Their revolt was led by Adolfo Diaz, Secretary-Treasurer of the La Luz Mining Company, in which Secretary of State Philander C. Knox was said to own stock. The Liberal government had smashed Diaz's forces and pinned 350 survivals at Bluefields, where Butler had been sent with the 4th Battalion. The American consul at Bluefields made it clear to Butler that the State Department wanted Diaz to prevail. 2 Liberal generals prepared to take the Bluefields with 15,000 well-armed men. Before the shooting could start, Butler sent them a message. The Marines were there only as neutrals protecting American residents, he told the attackers. The government forces could take the town, but must leave their guns outside the city so that no Americans were accidentally shot. Marine guards would be posted outside the city to collect all weapons from Nicaraguans entering it. How could they take the town, the dismayed generals protested, without arms? And why weren't Diaz's forces inside the town also being disarmed? Butler thought fast. There is no danger to the defenders killing American citizens, 'cause they will be shooting outward, he replied blandly. But your soldiers will be firing toward us. The ploy compelled the government forces to retract, giving the conservative forces time to regroup and mount a counterattack that soon overthrew the liberals. Juan Estrada became the new president, with Diaz as vice president. Butler felt somewhat uneasy about the role the Marines had been compelled to play in this coup, especially since he knew that the American people had no idea of how Secretary of State Knox was using the armed forces in Central America, or why. But as a Marine officer, he did not feel responsible for foreign policy. He saw his role simply as implementing that policy by dutifully carrying out his country's orders as he was sworn to do. Before the Marines returned to Panama, he was confronted by a host of Bluefield's shopkeepers who presented him with unpaid bills signed by members of his battalion, including George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Yankee Doodle. From the handwriting, Butler deciphered the true identity of these pseudonyms and saw to it that they paid up. The first to defend his men against injustices, he also insisted that they scrupulously honor their word to tradesmen in whatever foreign land they were stationed to protect the Corps' good name. 1 month later, the Nicaraguan revolutionary pot boiled over again. General Luis Mena, the Conservative Party's Minister of War, had overthrown Estrada as president and had been overthrown in turn by Diaz. Mena went into a rebellion with government troops loyal to him and had returned to attack Managua, the capital. Butler was rushed to Managua with a force of 350 men and ordered to prop up the faltering Diaz government. Finding Diaz in the field and government forces in the capital in chaos, he took command of them. The American minister informed him that the American banking interest had taken over the National Railroad as security for a loan to the Diaz government, so that it must now be protected as, quote, American property. But it ran through territory controlled by 3,000 of Mena's troops, who had captured a train and held it against a small marine force sent to retake it. Nicaraguan newspapers mocked the Americans' rout. Mena's forces refused to let any other trains through, cutting off supplies from the port. On August 25, 1912, Butler was forced to retake the captured train and open the railroad line. Angry that a Marine officer had failed in the task and made the Corps, quote, a laughingstock, he wrote to his wife, "The idea prevails very strongly that Marines are not soldiers and will not fight. I cannot stand any slur on our Corps, and I will wipe it off or quit."